In this Mastering the Fundamentals of Bubble Strategy video, we are going to discuss a lot of situations that you need to be aware of so that you do not torch your money on the bubble. Before we get started, I want to make it very clear that the bubble of a tournament is when you are either one person away from getting in the money or a very small number of people away from getting in the money, to the point that you can reasonably hang out and get in the money a large chunk of the time. Now, sometimes you should do that and sometimes you should not, and we will be discussing when in this video. But a very important point of the bubble is to avoid going broke. There's nothing glamorous about bubbling. There's nothing glamorous about trying to win the tournament on the bubble. Realize that collecting free equity is nice. As you get closer to getting in the money, or when there will be any sort of payout jump soon in a tournament, even if it is not incredibly tiny, you should avoid taking substantial risks that could bust you. Now, let's say you are playing a $100 buy-in tournament and you're already in the money, you're guaranteed $150. If the next payout jump is to $156, you shouldn't really care about it. But if the next payout jump is to $250, you probably should. So make sure you're aware of the payout structure that you are playing. You're going to find that you really want to avoid going broke when you have a very comfortable stack that can somewhat easily get into the money or collect the payout jump with almost no risk. That said, in a no-limit hold'em tournament where there's not any sort of abnormal payout jumps, you should not be super tight and blind out. I have seen players make insanely tight folds on the bubble because they really want to get a cash. I've seen people do all sorts of crazy stuff. One time in a WSOP event, I raised on the bubble of a $1,500 tournament with ace queen. Someone went all in for about 12 big blinds. I was getting my calling chips out, and this player said, "Please don't call me, I have aces. I really need to get in the money because I have no money." I believed him. I folded. He showed me the aces. Good for me, but that player torched their equity because they really wanted to cash. And while cashing is nice, it's not like some sort of huge success. Whenever you do get in the money in some major events, everybody claps and cheers. They did it. They got 1.5 buy-ins back. Congratulations. I know it may feel nice, but quite often the things that make you feel nice are not ideal for you. And realize that you do need to get in there and battle sometimes in order to try to win the tournament. I have found that many middle and short stack players tighten up far too early. Say there are 150 players remaining in a tournament and 100 get in the money. Some middle stacks decide, all right, I'm going in lockdown mode, I'm getting that cash. And they go from a 35 big blind stack down to something like a 20 big blind stack. They collect their cash and they're thrilled, but they don't realize they really ruin their chances of making a deep run and actually winning. Also, realize that the payout structure of the tournament will matter. Some tournaments have a very flat payout structure, and some tournaments have a very steep payout structure. For example, a long time ago when I won these WPT trophies back here, first place got a third of the money, 33% of the entire prize pool. Nowadays, the number's something like 15%. So, a long time ago, you were highly incentivized to gamble hard and try to win. Back then, I'd bubble all the time because the goal was to win the tournament. Now, the goal is a little bit less to win the tournament, and the goal is to hang out and slowly move up the payouts. So always make sure you're aware of the payout structure that you have in your particular venue. I have found that a lot of small buy-in local events often have pretty steep payout structures, so make sure you're aware of that if that's the case. Let's take a look at a simple ICM example. Let's say 4 players remain in the tournament, and each of them have 25% of the chips. This is when we're at a final table. Here are the payouts. First is $1,000, second is $700, third is $400, fourth is $200. If you're unaware of what ICM is, Google it. I'm sure you'll find an article. In this scenario, based on ICM, each player's stack is worth $575 on average, which you can easily figure out because they all have the same amount of chips, right? It's all the payouts divided by 4 players. This is $575. All right, if you get it all in with 50% equity, say you get it in with a classic coin flip, 50-50, your equity becomes $800 when you win, solved by an ICM calculator. Again, Google that, you'll find it. You can just type in the payouts, type in the stacks, you'll see your equity. And when you lose, you're going to take 4th place for $200, giving you $1,000 total. But that's terrible because You and your opponent both put in $575 in equity total, and you're only getting back 1,000. You put in 1,150, and you're getting back 1,000. Where'd that other $150 go? Well, it went to the players who just sat there and folded. And when there are payout implications, like when you're on the bubble of a tournament, you make a large chunk of money by staying out of the way and folding and letting other people go broke. It's important to note that all the stacks remaining in the tournament matter, and for that reason, you cannot give easy default pre-flop bubble play charts like you can for scenarios when there are not payout implications, like we have at pokercoaching.com in our app, because the stacks are going to be all over the place. For example, on the bubble, let's presume average stack is 25 big blinds, and you have 5 big blinds. This is actually fine if there are 300 players remaining in the tournament and 299 get in the money, because if you just sit here and blind out for 2 or 3 hands, someone at some table is going to go broke before you. And you can collect a free minimum cash. Your 5 big blind stack may be only, 2 starting stacks or less, but you can very easily sneak into the money in the spot because there are so many players remaining in the tournament that someone's going to get set up or they're just going to get it in and lose, right? It's also fine to have 5 big blinds if there are 5 players in the tournament with 1 big blind, because one of them's going to go broke. Say you're playing in a tournament with, 20 people, and 5 of them have 1 big blind, and you have 5, and everybody else has 40, or whatever it is. That's fine. Sit there, blind out, collect your free cash, because one of those 1 big blind stacks is going to go broke. However, say there are 9 players remaining in the tournament, and they all have 20 big blinds or more, and you have 5 big blinds. Now, it's kind of unlikely someone's going to go broke because, they're all sitting there staring at you and realizing you're going to be the one who goes broke next. And no one's anywhere near as short as you. So in this scenario, you're probably going to have to double up or bubble. And that's okay. But realize, for that reason, you cannot just give blind generic GTO preflop charts for bubble play, but we can use some rules and strategies to roughly figure out what to do in a lot of common spots. And that's where we're going to discuss risk premium. When you face a bet for all or most of your chips, when there are payout implications, you need more than your required amount of equity based on the pot odds to call. Sometimes much more, because like we just showed in that final table scenario, you and your opponent are putting in money, and some of it's going to go to the players who folded, right? So you have to make up for that, right? When you call and lose, or when you get it all in and lose, you are out or nearly out. And if you win, you do not double your equity. This is a very important point in tournaments. So you want to play cautiously, often very cautiously, when you are potentially at risk in a somewhat marginal spot. And in no limit Texas Hold'em, a lot of your spots are going to be very marginal. Also, you can flip this concept on its head, and when you're the bigger stack, you can look for scenarios to put your opponent at risk when you know they have to be overly tight. Essentially, your total equity required, accounting for the risk premium, is essentially the normal chip EV you need, based on just straight pot odds, plus some additional amount of risk premium. We're going to discuss how to figure that out. You also need to consider risk premium when you are both betting and calling a bet. Okay? It's not always, if they bet, how much more equity do I need? It's also, if I'm about to bluff, how much more equity do I need? Also, you're going to have a different risk premium against everyone at the table. So, say you have a medium stack against a shorter stack. In that situation, if you lose the hand, you still have some chips left. If you're the short stack, though, against the medium stack, your risk premium is going to be huge. Or say you're a medium stack against another medium stack. Now you have to be way more cautious compared to when you're against the short stack, because if you lose the hand, you're out of the tournament, right? Understand, though, that your risk premium is usually much less, or when your risk premium is less than your opponent's, you often get to apply a whole lot more pressure, which is why you see the big stacks often playing very aggressively. Here's a risk premium matrix. Again, like I said, this is a rough guide. It's often difficult to impossible to know exactly how much the risk premium is in your specific spot because of all the reasons we just discussed. But here's some rough guidelines, specifically for when you're at a final table facing an all-in or mostly all-in bet. And this often applies specifically on the bubble a large chunk of the time. Sometimes the risk premium is bigger, sometimes it's smaller. So, realize that you need your normal amount of equity based on the pot odds. Let's say in a scenario, your opponent pots it on the river, and you know you need to win a third of the time to break even. Okay, if you're in a scenario with a lot of payout implications, you want to look at this chart and realize that if you're a short stack against, let's say, a big stack, meaning if you call and go broke, you're out of the tournament, you're going to need an extra 9 to 15% equity to justify calling it off in this spot. So if you normally need to be 33% to win, maybe need to be something like 45% to win or 50% to win. Maybe even more. If there's a one big blind stack there on the bubble, you may need like 70% to win or something ridiculous. So you need to be aware of that, and you need to account for it. If you are a short stack against a medium stack, you need a little bit less equity, and short stack against short stack, you need a little bit less equity as well. If you're a big stack against a big stack, take a look at this. You need a ton of equity. Again, this is just a rough guide. I realize the spread is huge here, but it's important to realize, say you are on the bubble of a tournament, you're guaranteed to get in the money because you have, let's say, 50 big blinds and the average stack is 20. If the other player with 50 big blinds goes all in, and you're sitting there with pocket queens, and they show you ace king, you know you're roughly 50-50. But notice, because of risk premium, you need something like 18 to 35% more equity to call. So you need to be getting amazing pot odds to justify calling here, because even though you're 50-50, you actually need to have more like 70% equity, which is almost impossible. It's hard to have 70% equity before the flop in a tournament. So recognize that. Anyway, to use this chart, though, you look at your stack here, compare it to your opponent's stack size, and that's roughly how much more equity you need when you are facing a big bet. Notice if you're the big stack against the small stack, you don't really care because they're not making you risk a whole lot of money, which makes a lot of sense, right? Let's take a look and figure out how to consider this scenario. On the bubble, with no obviously tiny stack, so it's not some sort of insane payout implication bubble, everyone folds to the big stack with 40 big blinds in the small blind. Okay? You have 10 big blinds in the big blind. Which hand should your opponent go all in with? Take a second, think about it. Write it in the comment section down below if you feel like it. Click the like and subscribe button while you're down there. And also, which hand should you call with? More important question. In this scenario, your opponent should go all in with all of the hands. Why? Because you have a huge amount of risk premium here. You need an additional 9 to 15% equity to justify calling. And which hands you should call with? Well, again, unfortunately, it depends. Realize that if there are a bunch of one big blind stacks, or a bunch of overly active 10 big blind stacks who are probably going to go broke in the near future, or a ton of players remaining in the tournament, like we said, to say there's 300 players remaining and 299 get in the money, you need far more than this 9 to 15% equity that the chart here recommends. If you're the only short stack, like I said earlier, maybe you're on the bubble, but there's only a very small number of players in the tournament and you're the obvious short stack, you may need less than this 9% to call it off because you're going to be the one who goes broke next most of the time. Let's presume, though, you need an additional 12% equity due to the bubble, which maybe it's a little more, maybe it's a little less, whatever. Okay. You are calling 9 big blinds to try to win 21, which is your opponent's all in, you're all in, plus the big blind ante. So you need to realize 9 divided by 21%, or 9 divided by 21, which is 42.8% equity, assuming there are no payout implications. With payout implications, you're going to add that 12% risk premium we decided that we needed. Again, maybe it's more, maybe it's less. And because you want to actually profit, you're not trying to break even, you want to have a little bit more equity. Keeps getting worse and worse for you, huh? So let's say you need 56% equity in this spot to justify calling. Well, now, since you know your opponent should shove with any 2 cards, which hands have 56% equity against your opponent's range? Do you know? Hopefully you know if you studied a lot, but you do have to study a lot. Hate to break it to you, poker's hard. Here are the hands that have 56% equity against a 100% range. Notice ace-x suited, ace-4 offsuit and better, king-6 suited and better, king-8 offsuit and better, queen-8 suited and better, queen-10 offsuit and better, jack-10 suited, and pocket 4s and better. It's a pretty tight range. And like I said, if there are shorter stacks in the tournament, or if you're very likely to get in the money, you're going to call even tighter. Maybe like, I don't even know, pocket 9s and better, king-jack suited and better, ace 10 offsuit and better, stuff like that, like a really, really, really strong range. And it may seem insane to know that your opponent's shoving any 2 cards, and you should still fold the vast majority of hands. So make sure you account for that. At pokercoaching.com, we actually have a lot of content discussing how to play when there's not substantial risk premium, but only a little. But so this video is not super duper long. We're not going to be discussing that today. We also have a lot of post-flop situations where we discuss payout implications that we'll not be covering here either. Let's discuss a few other concepts though before we wrap it up and give you a bunch of examples. Realize that everyone is not aware of ICM. They do not care about the payouts. Some players will, some players won't. Some players have not studied ICM well. Other players just play for the win. They're trying to win the tournament. Other players do the opposite. They play really tightly. They blind out because they really care about getting in the money and moving up the payouts. Realize that your specific opponent's strategy is vitally important. If your opponent will defend loosely, tighten up, because remember, you really don't want to get action on the bubble. If your opponent will defend too tightly, though, you want to loosen up. Did I say that backwards? If they will defend loosely, you want to tighten up because you don't want action. Correct. Okay, got it. And if your opponent will defend tightly, you instead want to loosen up. And sometimes you can take this to the extreme. I had a situation one time at a final table, one of those that I won back there for $1 million actually, where somehow I learned that one of the players at the final table really needed to take fourth place to pay off his house. So I pushed this guy around so much until we got down to 4 players. You know what I did then? As soon as he went all in on the very next hand with a short stack, I snapped him off. I think ace 10. And the commentator said, wow, I can't believe he called there with ace 10. This guy's been the tightest player at the table. But I knew. He got his house paid off. Now he's gambling. He's trying to get rich. Snapped him off. Busted him. Ace 10 was way ahead. I don't remember what he had. Remember, I busted him, though. And that's good. Well, good for me. In general, some loose ideas here, some rough ideas. The largest stack can apply pressure to everyone at the table on the bubble. They should be min-raising a lot, assuming stacks are medium to deep. If a medium stack raises and they are not accounting for the fact that there are payout implications, you should be 3-betting them a lot. In position, you should be calling a lot and seeing a lot of flops. You should be defending the big blind a lot. You should be leading the flop a lot when the board is good for your range. Again, we discuss lots of scenarios like this at pokercoaching.com. We're not going to have time to go through all these scenarios, but as the big stack, you get to get in there and battle. As the medium stack, you can apply pressure to the other medium stacks who don't really want to go broke, and also to the shorter stacks who are pretty likely to get in the money. However, you kind of want to avoid the big stacks. If you have a big stack on your direct left, you need to tighten up because, well, they should be playing a lot of pots with you. Now, if the large stack will not play a lot of pots with you because perhaps they think they're supposed to get in the money, maybe the medium stack can actually act like it's the big stack, which is great because then you get to take your medium stack that normally has to play tight and you instead get to play far more loosely and you get to run your opponents over when you should not be able to. Short stacks should apply pressure to other short stacks and otherwise kind of try to get in the money, try to sneak in. Realize that ace X, especially suited, becomes very good pre-flop bluffing hands. And that's because when you have an ace in your hand, you make it more difficult for your opponent to have a hand that can shove it all in on you. So if someone raises, ace X becomes a very good hand to 3-bet or shove all in because you block your opponent's continuing range. It becomes very important. You're going to find that in most scenarios with payout implications, having an ace when you do decide to bluff is very important. Sometimes you should be the aggressor and sometimes you should be cautious. Realize you need to use some logic to figure out these scenarios. And also, sometimes you're going to be playing with various payout implications where maybe against one player you should be very aggressive. And against another player at your table, you should be very passive. Sometimes they'll have the same chip stack, depending on their tendencies. So you always want to make sure that you are accounting for that. Let's go through some examples. I have a bunch of examples loaded up here, probably far too many. Here we are playing in a scenario. We're going to presume we're on the bubble. We have 100 big blinds against a 75 big blind raise and the cutoff. We're in position. Ace-6 offsuit would normally be an easy fold. But as the big stack, you want to get in there. 3-bet, apply pressure. If there's a 5 big blind stack somewhere in the tournament or 2 big blind stack, you definitely want to apply pressure. Take that ace, blast them. Again, these are going to be mostly pre-flop hands, so we're not going to be going through them, but I'm not going to be going through a bunch of post-flop scenarios, but I do want to show you these are spots where you can kind of get out of line pre-flop, both in a tight way and in a loose way, depending on the spot. Here we are on the button. We raise it up 10-7 suited. Big blind. Opts to 3-bet. This is probably a hand that's okay to fold, normally, but not in this spot. We're going to call. We're going to defend. We're going to see the flop because we're in position, and the opponent, because of their immense post-flop risk premium, is going to have to be very cautious, even if they have a very good hand. And on boards that run out nicely for our range, which will have a lot of medium suited connected type stuff, whether or not we have a good hand, we can run a lot of bluffs. On this flop, though, ace, king, queen, the opponent bets. This is really good for them. It is atrociously bad for us. So fold. Don't think as the big stack that you must just maniacally apply pressure every single time. That is a mistake. When you're heavily disadvantaged, get out of the way. 9-7 suited. Normally a hand you'd probably want to fold from early position. As the big stack, though, raise it up. Somehow in this tournament, nobody cares if they bubble. They all call. Terrible flop for you again. Just fold. It's okay. Get out of the way. Pocket jacks. 75 big blinds deep on the bubble. Low jack raises. Normally a spot where 3-betting is very reasonable, but assuming there are short stacks in the tournament, like 5, 10, 15, 20 big blind stacks, you really don't want to get it in with jacks. This is kind of like that first scenario we covered. This is a situation where you should just call, see the flop, and go from there. And try your best to not have to play for all the money, because if you have to play for 75 big blinds on the bubble in this spot, you are not going to be happy. Get a bad flop, so my bets, we fold. All right, king 8 suited, 75 big blind stacks. Normally, if you look at GTO preflop charts, this is a raise. However, with a 75 big blind stack on our left and a 100 big blind stack on their left and a 100 big blind stack on their left, we need to be super tight. Like super tight. So we're just going to fold. It's annoying to have to fold pretty good hands, but whenever you have a lot of big stacks on your left, you have to be very, very tight in this spot. I mean, I might fold even tighter than this, like king 10 suited or something like that. Sounds nitty. Don't tell my opponents, but if you have players on your left who are highly likely to get in there and battle against you on the bubble, and they have more chips than you, that's not where you want to be. Ace 9 offsuit, 75 big blinds deep. In the small blind, certainly a reasonable spot to 3-bet normally, but out of position, on the bubble, no thank you. No thank you. Just get out of the way, move on with your life. 9-6 suited, 50 big blinds deep. 2 shorter stacks to our left, 2 50 big blind stacks in the big blind. This is probably loose, but if you told me the players you have to act are all going to be very cautious, I would get out of line here. You have to somewhat know the big blind's not going to defend too wide and they're going to be very straightforward. But if that's the case, or especially if there's just a shallow stack somewhere and you think everyone's going to let you run them over, sure, raise it up. Ace 9 offsuit again in the small blind. 50 big blinds deep. 50 big blind player raises. 50 big blind player calls. Cutoff calls. Button calls. Do we go for it here? I don't hate it. We do go for it. Like I said, the ace is a power card in these scenarios when you are going to bluff because you block their aces and ace king and ace queen. Hands that they're not really going to try to fold, which means they're less likely to have those, right? So because they're less likely to have those, when we are bluffing, we want a hand that doesn't especially want to call, but blocks their continuing range. And notice here, when you make it 1500, most players are going to shove or they're going to fold. And if they shove, you have an easy fold. And if they fold, well, we win a nice pot. Notice, by the way, whenever they fold, we win 1,200 chips. It's a lot. This time we get it through. We pick it up. Ace queen suited, facing a raise and a call. We have 40 big blinds. Some players rip it in on the bubble here. I think calling is probably a little bit more prudent, especially if there are very shallow stacks or any sort of short stacks in the spot. Yeah, it's a hand that you can certainly profitably go all in with for 40 big blinds, but on the bubble, again, chill out. Don't go broke. Ace 10 offsuit, 35 big blinds deep, 40 big blind stack raises. Get out of the way. This is especially going to be true if there are shorter stacks. I sound like a broken record, I know, but I want to give you a lot of examples to show you that sometimes you're playing very aggressively when you can apply a lot of pressure on your opponents, and sometimes you're going to be playing very cautiously. Ace queen suited again, raise, call, call. Another spot where jamming all in makes a whole lot of sense. And we do this time. I think calling is also reasonable. Notice in this scenario, no one has an obviously short stack, at least at our table. Like I said, though, if there are 2 big blind stacks at the other table, I'm definitely not shoving here and I'm going to call because it's a disaster to go broke with 35 big blinds before a 2 big blind stack. Ace 8 offsuit, 30 big blinds against the 18 big blind raise. Everybody else has 20 big blinds. We have a 10 big blind stack here. Now we're starting to play a little shallower stacked. Should you shove? The answer is no. This is a spot where you do not want to be shoving with hands like Ace 8 offsuit, because when you shove and get called, you're going to be in miserably bad shape. And if your opponent in the hijack's smart, they should only be raising pretty good hands. Now, I will say that a lot of players raise too wide with a 20 big blind stack, and when they face aggression, they just grumble and then they fold. And if that's the type of player you're against, I love 3-bet bluffing the ace-x offsuit in this spot. Queen 9 suited, 30 big blinds deep. Hijack raises, cutoff calls. I think it's a fine spot to rip it. Notice now we're putting on the squeeze play. The hijack has to worry about the cutoff slow playing, and if the cutoff is good, they will be slow playing aces here. But they're also going to have perhaps too wide of a calling range with medium-ish strength hands that will have to fold to the shove. Also, notice we're only risking 2,000 chips, and if we do get it all in and lose, we'll still have 10 big blinds, and hopefully we'll be able to outlast the other 10 big blind stack. So I think this is a nice spot to go for the all-in. This may seem a little bit aggressive, but I like it. Ace-10 suited. In the big blind. Big stack raises. We're a medium stack. You should already know. Don't goof off. Call and go from there. Ace-10 suited. Raise and call and call. And call. 30 big blinds deep. Can we rip this one in? Probably, as long as there's no obviously shallow stack. We do have a 10 big blind stack here. Ugh, it's kind of gross. I still opt to go for it in this spot. I don't love it, but this is a situation now that because there's an extra 750 in the pot that's going to be kind of dead, I don't expect these players to call off too often. I think this is a much more reasonable spot to shove. When there's extra money in the pot, you definitely get to be more aggressive. 7-2 suited, 25 big blinds deep. Should we rip it in? No, we should go for a min raise though. I do realize that you do get to be quite aggressive here, especially if there's an 8 big blind stack at the table, but you don't want to shove total trash hands. You should raise though. If you raise and get jammed, easy fold, move on with your life. Ace-jack offsuit. 8 big blind all in, under the gun +1. Should we call? Well, it depends on how wide this player's shoving. A lot of people think this is an auto call, but it's definitely not an auto call if this player is playing very tightly. Also notice if you call and lose, we lose a lot of our, call it big stack equity, where we get to push our opponents around because we can min raise a lot, or re-raise small over their initial raises. So, if you think the short stack is playing very tightly, I think this is a great spot just to let it go. You have to realize, hands like pocket sevens, ace-jack, ace-10, king-queen, they really don't fare all that well against an all-in. Plus, we have 2 people yet to act who could randomly wake up with the nuts. Ace-2 offsuit. Button raises, 13 big blinds deep. We're in the small blind with ace-2 offsuit. Should we jam in? We do this time. This is aggressive. I don't mind it though if you tell me the button's raising too wide. Again, you see how I'm going through a lot of scenarios that will kind of like qualify when this is good, right? If your opponent's raising too wide and they're going to fold too often, you in turn get to be hyper aggressive. If they're overly tight, you got to be way more cautious, right? If they have to be concerned with payouts and you don't, you get to be way more aggressive. If you have to be concerned with payouts, you tighten it up. Let's go through a few more examples to really hammer home these concepts. 15 big blinds deep on the button. We just put it all in. When you are the only shallow stack, you're going to find that you really don't want to get called. Assuming you're not like egregiously shallow, like if we have 3 big blinds, it's not going to make a difference, right? But here, I think a lot of people make the mistake of min raising and then getting shoved on, and then they think they have an easy call off. And to be here, you probably should call it off. But it's a spot where you don't love it, and you'd much rather shove and force your opponents to not have a scenario where they can call it off with small pairs or shove on you with random suited connected type stuff. So just shove in the pot. King 2 offsuit. 20 big blinds deep. Well, we have 20 big blinds. Everybody else has 10. Should we shove or min raise? I think a lot of players shove too often in this spot. They think that they should be shoving every hand in their range, but it is fine to min raise, especially with hands that are usually very dominated when you shove and get called. That's going to be King X, Queen X, Jack X offsuit. So these are pretty good hands to min raise. You can also min raise the absolute best hands. That way you don't have only trash in your min raising range. We get shoved. Now you have to fold the garbage, call the good hands. 9-7 suited. We rip it all in for 20 big blinds. This is a good example of a spot where now if we min raise for our opponent's 10 big blind stacks and get shoved on, we have to put in 8 to try to win 21 or 21 and a half. Or 22 and a half, right? And at that point, you need to win 35-ish% of the time, and 9-7 suited will. So because you'd have to call it off if you do face a shove, but you really don't want to be there, you'd probably rather shove yourself. King 7 offsuit, 11 big blinds deep, folds around to the small blind. They rip it in. Should we call or should we fold? We're the only short stack. That's a reason to call. but it's a pretty marginal spot. King 7 offsuit's normally a call here if there are no payout implications, but with payout implications, it's unfortunate, but we should let it go. Queen 7 offsuit, 6 big blinds deep on the button. This is a spot where we would normally open shove, but with payout implications, we should not, because the player in the big blind is going to call off decently often. We have to take a flip, and even with the shortest stack in the situation, we don't really want to take a flip. We would much rather hang out and hope someone busts on the bubble. That's a lot of examples. Here we have some general post-flop tips. As the large stack, continuation bets far more often than you normally would, and lead far more often than you normally would in scenarios where the board is good for your range, usually using a tiny size, because any bet you make shoves your, or pushes your opponent a little bit closer to being all in. Pushes is probably the wrong term. Push means to go all in. That's not what I mean. It nudges your opponent's stack into the pot. And when you're playing in a tournament with relatively shallow stacks, you get to nudge your opponent closer and closer to getting all in, to the point that by the river, all their money's going to be at risk, and they're going to need a huge risk premium to call. And as we've discussed earlier, it's often very hard to have the right equity accounting for risk premium. So you're going to be wanting to use lots of little bits of aggression. If you watch the final tables of the high roller tournaments on Poker Go, you will very often see the best players in the world doing exactly this. Also, you're going to want to triple barrel off far more often when the board is bad for your opponent. Say there's a scenario where they raise and you call on the button and it comes middle cards on the flop. They check, you bet, they call. The turn's whatever. They check, you bet, they call. Say the river puts up a 4 straight. Like say a 7 makes a straight. And they should have no 7s in their range. If they check, you're all in with everything. Like you just can blast them because they have all bluff catchers. And bluff catchers are roughly break even. And even if you're over bluffing, they're still not going to have enough equity most of the time to account for the risk premium. As the short stack, you're going to check raise less often in general, especially with bluffs, because again, you're trying to not play big pots without a large amount of equity. Also, you're going to want to make decently large folds on the river, even if you know your opponent will bluff a lot due to the payout implications because of the risk premium. It sucks to have to make a hero fold. It really, really does. I don't like folding, you know that. But whenever there's a lot of value in not going broke, well, don't go broke. And for that reason, you're going to find that you do want to get out of a lot of pots early instead of finding yourself on the river in these spots, because if your opponent's good, they will blast you. But the biggest step, avoid going broke. Don't lose all your money. Unless it's a good spot. Sometimes it's a good spot. You know, you get kings against someone who's loose and aggressive and battly, and you know they have a lot of ace-x. You know you're going to win 70% of the time on average, 68%, whatever. Sometimes you got to gamble. But for the most part, unless you are almost certainly going to be the next one to go broke, or your opponent's insane, you're going to want to try to not go broke on the bubble. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, do me a quick favor. Click the like and subscribe button below. This was a long video. If you enjoyed it, tell one of your friends. I know every single one of you out there has a friend who bubbles far too often. They're fish. What they do is they get it all in with hands they think they just have to get it in with. Ace, king, pocket jacks, flush draws on the flop. They think, I got a good hand, I got to rip it in. But no, they don't. Sometimes it's best just to sit back, collect your money, and then rip it in about 5 more hands. Share this with them. It will help them out a lot, and they will be forever grateful for you. Good luck in your games. Have fun. And I wish you the best of luck in all of your bubble endeavors. Thanks for watching.